Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. On this show, we're trying to instigate as well as follow the global insurrection against banker occupation. Few countries are moving up the scale of outrage from indifference. The key word this week is indignation. Not quite outrage and decapitation, but we're getting there. Stacy, tell me more.
Max, no wonder you're the leader of this global insurrection against banker occupation, because nobody does the indignated face better than you.
I am the king of self-righteous indignation.
Let's see the face.
Well, I brought a special occasion, Stacy. I just can't draw it like that. It's not a special occasions only. The people of Greece have moved, you see, from indifference. Their sovereignty is being taken away from them. In Spain, of course, now they're saying, they're asking themselves, why are we letting the global bankers do the DSK on us?
Ooh! Well, you know, some might have thought it was hyperbole to call it banker occupation, but check out this first headline, Max. Greece. Shocking new bailout conditions mean the end of national sovereignty. Yes, apparently the big news from Greece this week, that is, in order for the country to qualify for future bailouts, they are going to actually have to hand over to outside authorities the function of collecting taxes.
Well, as we've been saying on this show from the beginning, the objective of the outside forces, that being the IMF, which is controlled by the US, which is controlled by Wall Street, is to simply grab all of Greece's assets for pennies on the dollar and to annex the entire country of Greece, and that they should forego their sovereignty and their independence. Now they're just one more ride on Disneyland. Congratulations, Greece. You're now insignificant. Your entire 5,000-year history just got flushed down the toilet.
Well, those leading the charge include bankers and politicians from the Netherlands and also the Germans. So it takes me to this next headline: the Fed's secret giveaway to European banks. And as Reuters says, file under things you never knew the Fed did during the financial crisis. An $80 billion loan scheme known as St. Omo, which was so obscure that even Barney Frank had no idea it existed when he required the Fed to turn over its lending data in the Dodd-Frank bill. So it turns out that the Fed was making loans, extremely cheap loans of as little as 0.01%, when at the Fed's main bank window they were charging 0.5%. But most of these loans went to Credit Suisse, $45 billion, and Deutsche Bank, which is now being bailed out on the backs of the Greeks. But the fact is that these banks who are now occupying Greece would not even be alive if it were not for the rearming and the re-giving of ammunition, of weapons to these banks by the U.S. taxpayer who is backing the Fed ultimately.
Right. That's right. The money comes from the U.S. taxpayer.
Yeah.
That's right.
So,
and the U.S. taxpayer, by the way, is 50 million unemployed. They can't. I see that in America. They go to the hospitals. They don't. The price of medicines is so high. They're substituting like penicillin. They're substituting it with cheddar cheese. You go for a blood transfusion and they stick marshmallow fluff. They don't have enough money to give you adequate medicines to support this global scam. That's why people around the world are rising up.
But the other point here is that, okay, we're being told that the whole financial system is going to collapse if we don't bail out Deutsche Bank via forcing the Greeks to hand over the rest of their children's and their futures and all of this stuff. But why doesn't the Fed just open up this St. Omo, the St. Omo window at 0.01%, loan to Greece at that rate? Why just for Deutsche Bank and Credit Suisse and Soc Gen and BNP Paribas? Why only those banks?
Because, as we've explained it, these are the new Jim Crow laws. It's a form of discrimination. If you're Greek, you're the equivalent of being black in America before the civil rights movements. You have to sit at the end back of the bus. If you're Greek in this environment, you're treated like a second-class citizen. It's Jim Crow laws, financial Jim Crow laws using interest rates.
But I also think that this TARP will be known in the future as the Smoot-Hawley tariff of this Great Depression. You know, many say that the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which was a huge tariff that America placed on imported goods, in order to deal with the Great Depression. In fact, it caused a deep spiral. It caused the crisis to get worse. And I think you'll see that all these bank bailouts has become a matter of principle that they, no matter what, have to bail out these banks. And we see, despite the evidence, despite the death spirals, the debt spirals, the rising up of people around the world, they just refuse to back down from this losing bet.
That's right. They're not bailouts, it's ransom money. They're paying the ransom. And according to the propaganda coming out of the Pentagon, they don't appease terrorists. And yet they pay terrorist ransom to banks every single day.
So we're talking about banker occupation. And again, here's some more proof that the bankers are occupying us from the entire infrastructure of our economies and our political systems. Accusations of treason in the Greek parliament. So a minister, Mr. Kamenos, stood up and alleged that the Prime Minister, George Papandreou, was guilty of treason. And he said that members of the Prime Minister's team presided over the sale of $1.3 billion worth of credit default swap contracts on or around December of 2009, shortly after coming to power. So those 1.3 billion in credit default swaps would now be worth 27 billion euros, which would miraculously pay off most of these debts, or at least allow Greece to continue operating without needing to borrow money from the IMF for the next 2 years. But no, apparently George Papandreou sold these 1.3 billion in credit default swaps that the Hellenic Post Bank, a public banking arm of the Greek government, that they owned and they had bought in the previous few months. He sold it to a group of friends for a $40 million profit. These group of Greek oligarchs are now sitting on $27 billion that George Papandreou handed to him.
That's right. It's a clear case of tyranny and treason. That's why we say on this show there should be a regime change in Greece. And that means regime change, I don't know how to sugarcoat it. I mean, you go down there to the assembly, the parliament, or wherever this George Papandreou idiot is living, and you pull him out and you get rid of him because he committed treason. He committed treason. He committed tyranny. So what are you going to do about it? You're going to get drunk on ouzo like you do every other day? Or are you going to, oh, that's right, you want to be part of Disneyland. I forgot.
Well, so these $1.3 billion in credit default swaps, which are insurance against the default of Greece, okay, he sold them to these private investors in December of 2009, at the same time that he went to the IMF and told them they were going to need a 110 billion euro bailout. So he sold this to these people at the same time he knew that Greece was about to default, and those credit default swaps would be worth a whole lot more. And in fact, at the same time, he was in the press saying, people are naked short selling our sovereign debt, and this is bad. Well, but at the same time, the Central Bank of Greece quite curiously decided to change the legal settlement period for shorting government bonds from 3 days to 10 days. This had the ostensible effect of aiding naked short sellers who were able to keep their positions against Greek national debt open longer, thus driving down the price of the country's bonds, spiking its yields, and pumping up the price of Greek CDS.
So Papandreou was involved in fraud on 3 distinct occasions during this whole period of financial terrorism that is now resulting in the loss of Greek sovereignty.
Well, it's a pincer movement. It's a movement that would make it's financial war that would make General Patton happy. He would be impressed with this. He would think that this pincer movement, he went at it from all sides, and somebody he knows made $27 billion.
Well, I mean, as we've been saying all along, Stacy, the country of Greece is not bankrupt. The IMF is bankrupt. George Papandreou is bankrupt. Who knows what money he owes some casino or some drug lord somewhere, what kind of drug habit he's got, where he's willing to sell his frickin' country for a few quid.
It's $27 billion, and the people of Greece should demand us back. The victims of Bernie Madoff are able to go to the people who benefited from his scheme and take their money back. So why don't the people of Greece say, give us back that $27 billion that was sold to you fraudulently?
They are owed $27 billion. Papandreou knows where the money is. It sounds like Papa Doc, doesn't it? He's another one of these fly-by-night dictators that comes in, ransacks the country, and sails off somewhere with his crack whores and his cocaine.
But it's not just Europe that is occupied by banksters. It's also the United States. Headline reads, Max, why a hedge fund comprised of junior congressional Democrats should outperform the market by 9%. Well, according to a new study called Abnormal Returns from Common Stock Investments of Members of the U.S. House of Representatives, apparently congressmen outperform the market by 9%.
Because we know why.
Well, they're allowed to insider trade.
That's right.
But they're beaten by senators who outperform the market by 12%.
And how do they do that?
With insider information. For example, they used the case of the asbestos ruling that Bill Frist announced, I think it was in 2005, when he said they wouldn't be seeking a fine against these asbestos companies. Well, we knew because the market on these companies skyrocketed the week or two before. And of course, it was all the senators who had the decision to make power, to make the authority, to make the laws.
Right, and Buzzy Krongard was buying 9/11 airline puts 2 weeks before 9/11. That's obvious, it's in the record. So the people in Washington trade on inside information. And that's clear in the record, and nobody can come on this show and refute that.
Actually, the congressmen outperform the market by 6%. It's the Democratic ones that outperform by 9%. Republicans only outperform by 3%.
It's the Democratic-Republican whore index. The Democrats are winning, the whore index. Well, it's surprised that they don't make more money. I think the reason they're only beating the market by single digits is that probably most of the money they make is sitting in offshore accounts and off-balance sheet accounts. You don't even see it.
Well, speaking of offshore, this is my final headline here, Max. Mysterious fund allows Congress to spend freely despite earmark ban. So the defense bill that just passed the House of Representatives includes a backdoor fund that lets individual members of Congress funnel millions of dollars into projects of their choosing. So the fund is called the Mission Force Enhancement Transfer Fund. And roughly $1 billion has been transferred out of this to congressmen's local pet projects and kickbacks, including from Steve Palazzo, Republican of Mississippi, a Tea Party candidate. But it allows them, this secret slush fund allows them to pretend, we're fiscal conservatives. Vote for us, you people in your little patriot hats.
Yeah, they don't like to obey any of the laws. So they just create ways to avoid complying with any law. But they need people to break the law to put them in prison, because that's where the majority of their profits come from ultimately, is running the prison gulag complex. So they are running this double-edged sword where they don't obey the law, but they have to enforce trivial laws on everyone else to supply the prison industrial complex so that they can make the money to get themselves reelected.
Well, I think it just goes back to the beginning of the episode as well, that it's a global insurrection against banker occupation. We're occupied by bankers. No matter where you look, you see bankers.
All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away. Much more coming your way, so stay right there. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to go to Chile. Talk with Gonzalo Lira of the Strategic Planning Group. Gonzalo, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
It's a pleasure as always being on your show. Thank you for having me.
All right, so Gonzalo Lira, first let's talk about Europe. Greece and Ireland are in debt spirals thanks to the IMF and ECB imposed financial collapse. It now looks like Greece will have to allow outside agencies to start collecting their taxes. Your thoughts?
We've got so many problems in Europe that it's just pathetic. Okay, as you said, that the IMF and the ECB are talking about actually taking over the sovereign responsibility of Greece and starting to collect taxes, which is absurd. Now you have Christine Lagrange, who's going to take over as the IMF. It seems like a lock. The Americans are going to support her. Christine Lagarde is not a disinterested economic player. She not only is she a close and long-standing friendship with the United States and American politicians, she is going to be bucking for the French presidency in 2017 after Nicolas Sarkozy's term expires, or second term expires. And so she is going to be fulfilling her duties at the IMF from a political perspective, not from a purely economic perspective. So she's going to do what Dominique Strauss-Kahn was doing. And Dominique Strauss-Kahn was not this wonderful guy. Basically, he was just throwing money at the problem and doing bailout after bailout, as opposed to the hard haircuts that have to be made. I mean, we have to restructure these debts. That's the only way that the European peripheral countries are going to be able to get out of this hole that they're in.
Because the central planners are not restructuring the debts, they're simply foisting more debt onto the bonfire of debt. Should these countries simply default,
No, they shouldn't just default. They should renegotiate and take haircuts and do what you normally do in a sensible debt restructuring situation. I mean, if you have a creditor who recognizes that the money that they are owed is not going to be paid back in full, then the smart thing is for the creditor to sit down at the negotiating table and restructure these debts, but not to push the debtor to the wall to default. I mean, what's the point of that? It doesn't help anybody and it hurts everybody.
Yeah, but who's going to negotiate on behalf of Greece? Papadreou is in with the neoliberal banking shysters. They've got no government representation. They've got nobody at the table representing the people of Greece. So they're just being sold down the river. What happens is the assets are being transferred to these bankers for pennies on the dollar. So that's their intention all along. So nobody's negotiating for them. They should just default or a regime change. What about a regime change? Now, in Latin America, during a similar situation, the people rose up and they kicked the bums out. Should the Greek people kick Papadreou to the curb?
The Greeks are going to default. The Greeks should kick them to the curb, and so should the Irish, as a matter of fact. I mean, if we're going to start doing regime change, we should just start doing it across the European continent.
Yeah,
because all these people are in bed together, and all of them don't have the best interests of the people at heart. They have the best interests of the banking establishment and the political establishment at heart. That's the problem.
Yeah, so again, the analogy with Latin America. Obviously, down there in Chile and in other Latin American countries like Argentina, famously, well known there, what happens when you've got the bankers and the politicians coming together to create a fusion of interests of the kleptocrats, and they literally just run away with any of the money that's left. So why don't the Greek people understand that they are on the verge of having their entire wealth confiscated from them by Christine Lagarde and the other kleptocrats who are circling like vultures, whether they've got a strap on or not? They're going to be down there doing damage.
Well, actually, I think that the Greek people do recognize this. I mean, yesterday there was a protest of about 100,000 people, and there have been, protests in Spain, and I would guess that there's going to start being protests in Ireland as well. People recognize that they're being screwed by their own leadership. And I think that that's the problem. You have a leadership, a European leadership, that is completely disconnected from the people. There is the leadership class in Europe that wants European integration, but you have the great mass of people who do not want it. And so you have this situation where this discontinuity between the leadership class and the people, and it's going to continue and it's going to get worse.
All right, you mentioned the word integration there. So let's talk about that for a second. In other words, what the folks in Europe, the bankers in Europe want, they want to be able to administer all of the European countries from a central bank, because that's been missing so far in the Euro project. They don't really have the ability to, on the fiscal side of things, collect taxes on behalf of the ECB or some kind of central bank. So presumably this is the beginning of the bureaucrats in Europe creating some kind of European-wide taxing authority.
So you have two issues. You have, on the one hand, the EFSF, the European Financial Stability Facility, which is the European-wide mechanism to issue bonds, and that has been trying to take over the bond-emitting mechanism of the peripheral countries. And on the other hand, now it seems as if the ECB, or the European Finance Ministry, is trying to take over the ability of the individual nations to collect taxes in their own country. So yeah, you have this centralization. The issue becomes, of course, whether the people of these countries will stand still for this. My bet is they will not. And my bet is that the peripheral countries will be the first to bolt, and it would seem reasonable that Greece would be the first because it's the weakest. And if it goes back to the drachma, or creates the new drachma, if you will, and instantly devaluates the drachma, 20% in the first day and maybe, say, 60 to 75% in the first 5 weeks, what would happen, of course, would be what happened to Iceland, which is they suffered short-term pain, but over the next year or two, they recovered. And I think that that would become the poster child for Greece exiting the euro. And if Greece exits the euro, I think that other countries, I'm looking at you, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, they're going to start thinking to themselves, hey, if the Greeks did it and it wasn't so bad, why don't we do it? And I think that that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, I saw an interesting comment on zerohedge.com. Which was attached to a story on this Greek saga. And one of the commenters said that, well, why doesn't Greece just let all these outside interests buy all of their assets for cash and then renationalize them?
I think that, well, it could happen. I mean, in Argentina, they do that every other weekend, to tell you the truth. I don't think that Greece is going to be in the Eurozone very long. I think that that's the bottom line issue. And I think that every bet from a financial standpoint should be the Greeks are going to exit the Eurozone. That's the only solution to this problem. And whoever is the new IMF head, it doesn't really matter, because they're going to continue with the same medicine, which is bailing out and kicking the can down the road. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to pay this bill. And this bill is going to come due one way or the other. It is $227 billion. And the Greeks do not have that money. Somebody said, oh, well, maybe they could nationalize all the Greek gold. Well, the Greek gold in total is about 112 tons. So you're talking about $5 billion. Add up, all the other assets they could possibly liquidate. And you're talking maybe $30 billion total, tops. $30 billion against $227 billion. That's about 10%. That doesn't make anybody better. So I think at the end of the day, either they renegotiate, and if they are unwilling to renegotiate, as it is seeming increasingly clear, especially because Christine Lagarde was one of the people who was instrumental in the Basel III Accord of keeping the low capitalization of the banks in place. She doesn't want to renegotiate because she recognizes that if they renegotiate and the banks take a hit, the banks will be insolvent. And she's not going to allow that for the French banking system, let alone the German banking system. So they're going to play hardball with the Greeks, and that is just going to push them further off the cliff, and eventually they're going to just quit the euro. And it is going to be worse for the European financial system if that happens, because then potentially the Greeks could simply repudiate all the debt, or worse, or which is the same, which is convert all that debt into new drachmas and then instantly devalue the drachma. The French and the German financial and economic and political interests have to sit down with the Greeks, with the Irish, and with the Spaniards, and they have to renegotiate. They have to renegotiate now while they still can, because later, when the first of these countries exits the euro and their world does not end, the other countries are going to get the idea that, hey, why don't we leave the euro? And they're going to exit the euro, and it's going to be worse for the French and German banks, and it will precipitate a crisis which will be worse than the 2008 crisis.
So, Gonzalo Lira, as part of the strategic planning group, you advise clients on the safest places to live for economic freedom as well as for environmental and political safety. Again, for those who live in America, there is such thing as called environmental risk. I know it's not recognized by your media there, but it's actually real. Now, what about Europe? Based on what you see happening now, is it safe to stay in Europe?
No, not from a financial point of view. I think that everybody's going to take a big hit in the near-term future. I'm talking about the next 12 months on the outside because of this Eurozone mess that we're having. I think that the currency of choice would be the Swiss franc. I think that because there's going to be a flight to safety, especially as the first of the weak Eurozone countries leaves the euro. And I think that from a financial perspective, the Europeans are going to panic, and they're going to start tightening the screws in order to save their situation. And I think that that's going to accelerate a flight to safety.
Okay, now you're noted to be in the camp of the hyperinflation.
Yes, I'm one of those deluded souls. Yes, that's me, delusional.
I did not say that, but I think we're on the same page there. But what about the U.S. dollar in this scenario?
That's an interesting question. I think that, if there's a flight from the euro, I think inevitably there is going to be a flight to the treasury bonds and the U.S. dollar. And I think that potentially that could be a good thing, a little bit of postponing the day of reckoning insofar as the dollar is concerned. But as the saying says, postponing the day of reckoning doesn't mean that you're ending the day of reckoning. It's going to be coming the same. And I think that as QE2 ends now, and the economic indicators do not improve, as they will not improve, as they have not improved after $600 billion worth of money printing over the last 8 months. But there's going to be a return to more treasury purchases by the Federal Reserve, because the problem with the U.S. deficit is the Treasury Department does not have enough buyers for all this debt that it's issuing. I mean, there simply aren't enough buyers, and every other major buyer, China, Japan, Europe, they're all exiting treasuries for different reasons. I mean, the Europeans because they have problems of their own, the Japanese because they have problems of their own, the Chinese because they're very afraid of the dollar and treasury bonds. So there aren't enough buyers for the issuance that the Treasury has on deck, which is over the next 12 months, I think it's something like 1.5 trillion or something like that. It doesn't really matter. I mean, 100 billion here or there, it doesn't really matter. It's over $1.5 trillion.
All right, Gonzalo Lira. Personally, I'm in Jim Rogers' camp. I would take the euro over the dollar, but we can talk about that on another time. Thanks again for being once again on the Keiser Report.
It's a pleasure as always. Thank you for having me.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Gonzalo Lira. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.